The Baia Mare Cyanide spill was described by the Hungarian government as Europe's worst environmental disaster since Chernobyl. The chain reaction of this disaster began with a single catastrophic failure when on January 30th, a dam near Baia Mare in northwestern Romania collapsed. The dam held back a massive reservoir of liquid waste from a nearby gold mine, waste that was contaminated with cyanide and heavy metals. And when the dam broke, over 100,000 cubic meters of toxic slurry surged into the surrounding land, eventually making its way to the Someș River. And from there, it flowed into the Tisza and then into the Danube, heavily contaminating major water supplies in multiple countries such as Romania, Hungary, Serbia, and beyond. Within a few hours, fish were dying by the ton. Hungary reported entire stretches of the Tisza River suffering ecosystem collapse. Tens of thousands of people were left without safe drinking water. And in some places, people were told not to touch the water at all. This is the story of the Baia Mare Cyanide spill in Romania, Europe's worst environmental disaster since Chernobyl. The spill came from a dam near a gold mine that was operated by Oral SA, a joint venture between a Romanian state-owned company and an Australian firm called Esmeralda Exploration. They used a method called cyanide leaching, where basically they'd reprocess old mining waste to extract leftover gold. It's a cheap method, but very risky since cyanide is deadly even in tiny amounts. And yeah, it's every bit as dangerous as you'd imagine. The mining plant stored its cyanide-contaminated wastewater in a tailings dam near the Someș River, which flows into a network of rivers crossing borders. And the dam was built from earth and synthetic materials, which was cost-effective, but it couldn't handle heavy rain combined with melting snow, which is exactly what happened that winter. At around 10 p.m., one of the dam's walls eventually collapsed. About 100,000 cubic meters of wastewater spilled out. That's like 40 Olympic swimming pools of cyanide and heavy metals. But there were no alarms or warnings issued by the company at all. The first warnings even came from downstream, from fishermen and locals who reported large numbers of dead fish. And by the time Romania admitted the breach, the spill was already in Hungary. That delay, even just hours, meant that other countries had no time to prepare. And Esmeralda Exploration tried to downplay the situation by claiming that the spill was contained. But Hungarian and Serbian monitors showed cyanide levels 700 times above safe limits, and the Tisza River lost 80% of its aquatic life along hundreds of kilometers. The tailings dam that failed in Baia Mare was constructed in 1998 and collapsed less than 2 years later in January 2000. It was constructed specifically for the Aural project, which aimed to extract leftover gold and silver from old mine waste using cyanide as mentioned earlier. But the design was flawed right from the beginning. The dam was built on top of a former mine tailings site, which already had compromised subsoil. The ground wasn't stable either, as it had a tendency to shift and absorb water unevenly. And while engineers were aware of this, the project moved forward anyway. The structure used an upstream construction method, which is usually considered safer but still risky on unstable ground. It's cheaper and faster than more reinforced designs, but it's also vulnerable to collapse, especially when the foundation is soft or saturated with water. This method involves building successive layers of the dam outward and upward, but it's not ideal for wet climates or areas with variable rainfall. And in January 2000, heavy snowmelt and constant rain hit the region. The water table under the dam rose sharply and instantly saturated the base. And at the same time, there were issues with the dam's drainage and monitoring systems, but reports later showed that the warning systems lacked sensitivity and alarms were either missed or ignored. When pressure built up inside the dam, there was no immediate response from the dam's officials, and by the time the structural failure occurred, it was too late to contain the spill or divert the flow. A Romanian government report released later that year found the dam's design fell short of European safety standards. It also noted a lack of independent oversight during construction and operation. The Oral joint venture operated with little outside oversight and relied mostly on periodic inspections by local authorities. There was also a disconnect between technical reports and regulatory enforcement. In theory, the project was supposed to meet international safety norms. On paper, it looked fine, but in practice, corners were cut, maintenance was inconsistent, and no one could agree on who was responsible for this disaster. The moment cyanide hit the river, the damage spread with terrifying speed. Within 24 hours of the spill, contaminated water had traveled over 100 kilometers downstream, and by the end of that first week, it had crossed into Hungary, where the scale of likely due to secondary poisoning. One of the hardest hit areas was the Tisza stretch through Hungary's Hortobágy National Park, which is a protected UNESCO biosphere reserve, and it took only a few days for years of ecological progress to be undone. And this wasn't just about biodiversity. Entire communities were impacted by the contamination. And by mid-February, the UN and European Commission had been briefed. What began as a national issue in Romania had escalated into an international crisis. The Romanian government responded by launching its own investigation and promising accountability, but public statements from the mining company downplayed their role, calling the event an act of God and emphasizing that cyanide breaks down quickly in sunlight and air. Now, that's technically true that cyanide degrades over time, but the sheer volume of the spill and the speed at which it moved meant that the breakdown wasn't fast enough to prevent widespread damage. Hungary then requested compensation, but Romanian officials resisted, and this tension eventually led to diplomatic strain, with both governments blaming each other for the inadequate response. Meanwhile, EU environmental observers visited the affected sites and began drafting new proposals for mining regulation and cross-border emergency protocols. And a few months after the Baia Mare spill, the focus shifted from emergency response to accountability. There were questions about who should be held responsible, and more importantly, how similar disasters could be prevented in the future. Esmeralda Exploration publicly denied any negligence. They insisted the dam met international standards and claimed that the incident was caused by extreme weather that hit the region on that fateful day. They also pointed to meteorological data, argued that the failure was unforeseeable under normal conditions. On the other side, Romanian officials were now under pressure from both the international community and their own people. They launched a criminal investigation, but eventually, legal responsibility proved difficult to pin down. The mine operated as a Romanian-Australian joint venture, which meant regulatory oversight was shared between national and foreign actors. The Romanian side handled permits and environmental reviews, but many of the technical decisions, including dam design and waste handling, were directed by Esmeralda engineers and contractors. Initial Romanian investigations found serious shortcomings in the dam's construction and maintenance. The most notable was the lack of a proper drainage system under the tailings pond, which had allowed water pressure to build up unchecked. Investigators also noted that Oral had continued pumping slurry into the pond even as water levels approached the maximum safety threshold, which meant warnings were either ignored or not properly escalated. But despite these findings, no criminal charges were successfully brought against company executives or government officials. The Romanian courts cited a lack of clear evidence that the failure resulted from criminal negligence rather than unforeseeable natural conditions. It was a legal gray area, and it stayed that way. Meanwhile, in Hungary, the government pursued financial compensation through international legal channels. They demanded over 100 million in damages from both Oral and the Romanian state, citing the ecological and economic impact on their territory. But because there was no binding international framework for cross-border environmental liability at the time, the legal process stalled and no settlement was ever reached. The European Union, which neither Romania nor Hungary were members of at the time, responded by pushing for new legislation. The most direct result was the development of the EU's 2006 Mining Waste Directive. it introduced stricter rules for the management of mine tailings, including tighter controls on cyanide use, mandatory risk assessments, and detailed safety protocols for dams and ponds. The directive also required member states to ensure that companies operating high-risk facilities carried adequate insurance or financial guarantees. While the directive didn't retroactively apply to Baia Mare, its design was directly shaped by it. In other words, the spill became a case study for everything that could go wrong when modern mining operates without robust safeguards or oversight. Romania then revised its own environmental laws as it was under pressure to align with EU standards ahead of its 2007 accession. Since then, permitting processes became more rigorous, and risk assessments became more standardized as well. But implementation remained uneven, especially in remote or economically struggling regions where mining was one of the few reliable industries left. Over the years after the Baia Mare spill, scientists and environmental agencies kept a close eye on the Tisza and Danube river systems since the long-term effects were harder to measure. The most visible impact was the loss of aquatic life across the region. Estimates vary, but Hungarian researchers estimated that over 1,200 tons of fish had died in the weeks after the spill. Entire stretches of river had to be repopulated from hatcheries. Some native species, like the sterlet and wild carp, took years to return in measurable numbers. But the damage went far beyond fish. Cyanide's damage isn't always obvious to the eye, and by the time levels dropped below toxic thresholds, the deeper biological damage had already been done. Algae populations were disrupted, and tiny organisms at the base of the food chain like insects and larvae were nearly wiped out. And in some sediment samples taken a year later, traces of heavy metals like lead and zinc were still present at elevated levels. These weren't directly from the cyanide itself, but from other heavy metals in the mining waste that had been carried along with it. And cyanide made things worse as it latched onto those metals. So the contamination didn't just stay where the spill happened. It spread downstream and sank into the riverbeds. Long-term ecological monitoring programs were set up in both Hungary and Serbia, and over time, data showed gradual recovery in most key indicators. But the pace varied. Some sections of the river recovered within 3 to 5 years. Others remained biologically degraded for over a decade. And the devastation hit Hungary's Hortobágy National Park especially hard, as one of the worst hit areas. It required a multi-phase restoration effort, but with the river crossing international borders, and by the late 2000s, both Romania and Hungary claimed there was no significant residual contamination in their national assessments, meaning cyanide and heavy metal levels had returned to within regulatory limits. But environmental groups pushed back on their statements, pointing out that within limits didn't mean harmless. It just meant no longer illegal. Some losses in this disaster can't be measured in numbers. The way people stopped trusting the authorities, the traditional knowledge lost when a river can no longer sustain life, or how an ecosystem, even when it seems fine, becomes brittle. The people in the region have learned a harsh lesson, that decades of ecological recovery can vanish overnight if another spill hits. That's what makes Baia Mare hard to classify. On paper, the damage was temporary, but the systems it damaged weren't designed to fail all at once, and the ones built after haven't always been strong enough to prevent it from happening again. So how do we classify Baia Mare? A contained incident or a warning? Because every temporary disaster exposes permanent flaws, and the next spill is always one weak dam away.